Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, spies for hire. The latest US snooping controversy has highlighted more than just online privacy issues. It's shown up a massive and extensively backed security industry. So, just what is your data worth to governments and the likes of Facebook and Google? Also this week, Iran. The elections come and gone, but what about the challenges? Well, where to start? Unemployment, soaring inflation, falling oil output. The new president's got some tough work ahead. And fracking in the USA, it means a cut in oil imports. But what are the consequences for America's relationship with OPEC and the other oil-producing nations? There is nothing quite like a leak of secret documents to get people talking. WikiLeaks was a classic example of that. But when the scale and, more importantly, the nature of Operation PRISM became apparent this past week, well, it was all just a bit closer to home, wasn't it? Chances are you've heard about PRISM by now, a top-secret electronic surveillance program run by America's National Security Agency. At least it was top secret until a former NSA worker blew the lid off it. Pretty much anything and anyone is fair game with PRISM. Emails, voice calls, file transfers, social network information, the lot. Now, whether you believe surveillance is a trade-off for security or not, the question has to be asked. Just how safe is your privacy? See, nations spend billions spying on their own citizens and people overseas, whether that's hacking, intercepting phone calls, or just requests from governments to private companies. The exact numbers, you guessed it, they're a secret, but this is what we can glean. In the United States, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and other non-military spy agencies will get $48 billion next year. Britain's spending around $3.6 billion on its spy agencies. And China, well, pretty secretive at the best of times, but what we know is that its spending on, quote, internal security was $111 billion last year. But let's concentrate on the United States. So much data is being collected there, and obviously since 9/11 there's a much greater emphasis on intelligence gathering. And so the US government's called in the private contractors to help them join up the dots. Now, we mentioned the former NSA worker who's brought all of this to light. This is him, Edward Snowden, who leaked the documents to Britain's Guardian newspaper and also the Washington Post. He actually worked for a company called Booz Allen Hamilton, which, if you do a quick Google search for it, as we did a little bit earlier, it brings up this description in the Google search box. It's just going to zoom in there. Booz Allen Hamilton, a leading provider of management and technology consultant services to the US government in defense, intelligence, and civil markets. Now, Booz Allen had revenues of $5.8 billion in 2012. More than half came from defense business and a full quarter from work with the intelligence community. Booz Allen says it's shocked by Snowden's disclosures and it's promised to cooperate with the government investigation. So let's start with that this week. How a private company and others like it become part of a US spying operation that is arguably a lot bigger than any of us thought. Here's Tom Ackerman with more.
The world is a dangerous place.
An old joke about the National Security Agency is that its initials stand for Never Say Anything. But it does talk about the quality of its workforce.
Why NSA employs only the most intelligent people in the country.
Yet the exposure of secrets by NSA contractor Edward Snowden highlights the spy agency's dependence on outside personnel since the September 11, 2001 attacks. Of the nearly 5 million people with government security clearance, more than 1.4 million hold top secret classification. And only half those top secret holders are government employees. 38% of them work for private contractors.
We talk about decreasing the size of the federal workforce, but all we've done is then increase it with a shadow workforce of contractor employees. They're a lot harder to administer, to oversee, to monitor.
Just across the road from NSA headquarters near Baltimore is a complex of offices called the NSA Business Park. Its tenants are all contractors for the agency, including Booz Allen Hamilton, Snowden's now former employer. The current Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, James Clapper, spent 6 years as a Booz Allen senior executive. And Booz Allen's current Vice Chairman, Mike McConnell, is a former DNI. Describing the challenges of corporate cybersecurity, he recently spoke, perhaps ironically now, about the value of trust in sharing data.
They've got to understand the benefit, and they can trust the other party. It's that trust factor that's required to get the information shared.
Since 2007, the government has promised to reduce its dependence on private companies, but it's made little progress.
We felt they were required for the national security of this country. There will come a time, and it is now, where we're going to have to make some hard choices.
But there's no assurance that shrinking the ranks of outside contractors will eliminate the risk of leaks. As witness the case of Army Private Bradley Manning, now on trial for exposing hundreds of thousands of confidential government documents.
Right, so that's the shop front for all of this. Security services and the private contractors they use, trawling for data which would in theory make us safer. But then there's the other element which has concerned people the most. The idea that the likes of Google, Facebook, Microsoft and Apple gave backdoor access to the NSA to snoop on users' data. They all deny that, but still it begs the question of what your data is really worth, given that most people simply hand over their photos and their personal information and their documents to such websites without giving it a second thought. Well, here's what is being spent on it. The data industry in the United States alone is worth $300 billion a year and employs some 3 million people. That's coupled with the online sales industry, which you become part of every time you buy or sell something. That's $10 trillion generated right there. And all of this is managed, if you like, by the more than 2,000 so-called data broker companies. Axiom Corp's the biggest. It's got a profit of $77 million in 2011, coming from the largest commercial consumer database with 500 million active users worldwide. So you see, your data is definitely worth something. But money over privacy? Well, here's a couple of views on the debate at the center of all of this.
One example that is well publicized is around sentiment analysis, allowing organizations to see how their brand and their products and services are being discussed. So if there's an issue with a product, it is much easier for an organization to immediately jump in and actually help a customer. Another example would be in using sensor technology in manufacturing, for instance. It is fairly common by now to put sensors in equipment that tell an information system on when certain pieces of equipment need maintenance, and that helps saving costs. You can translate it to people as well. Take, for instance, a health monitoring. You can keep patients at home with sensors that monitor their health instead of them having to be in the hospital, which is better and cheaper. We reckon that about 25% of organizations that are using consumer data to do analytics will face some kind of reputation risk or issues in doing that. They are to blame because the organizations are too careless with what the consumers feel is their data.
Well, I think people need some level of self-awareness. Obviously, if you're using completely open social media like Twitter, you want people to know what you're saying online. I don't think most people are aware that sites like Facebook, which they tend to think of as being private spaces where they can share information with their friends and family, were open to this level of surveillance. I'm sure people don't think about that, about their email and other kinds of private correspondence, but also it goes further than that. It's not just information that people are themselves consciously choosing to put online. Of course, more and more of people's interaction with business and interaction with government is going to leave all sorts of electronic data trails that they have absolutely no control over. Of course, governments need to be doing targeted investigations to try to stop terrorist outrages and serious crime and so on. I don't think that means, though, that they need to be doing these very broad sweep surveillance of everyone, data mining, crunching their way through everyone's activities in the hope that they'll pull out interesting patterns.
And one more thing before we hear from another expert on all of this, and this is quite cool, but it's a little scary as well, actually. Have a look. It's an add-on for the web browser Firefox, which some of you know, and this add-on is called Collusion. It basically lets you track those who are tracking you. So let's say you went to the website IMDb, Internet Movie Database. These 3 behavioral tracking sites, things like doubleclick.net, they come up, they're tracking what you're doing. Then we add another website into it here. We've got the New York Times coming in, and you'll see it pops out a couple more tracking sites. But the key is that they start joining up with the original ones. So there's IMR Worldwide, but doubleclick.net is now with both of them. Add another one in again. We've got the Huffington Post here, a big media website here. And again, the web starts to spread AOL.com, the blue one on the right-hand side, that's now in there as well. And these are all linking up. All of these tracking sites are now tracking you across all of these different sites. And then, as you see, we can throw a couple more in with GameSpot.com. There's also Reference.com, and the whole thing starts to go a little bit crazy, this whole web of online tracking. The creator of Collusion, and indeed of Firefox, is a company called Mozilla, which has been leading the charge against companies tracking our every move online. And I'm delighted to say that Mozilla's Chief Privacy Officer, Alex Fowler, is joining us this week from San Francisco. And looking at the front page of Mozilla, as we were a little bit earlier, it said, "We are Mozilla, doing good is part of our code." Now, forgive me, but that sounds a lot like one of your competitors who used to say, "Don't be evil." Explain what it is that's different about you.
Well, thanks, Kamal. It's great to be here with you today. From a Mozilla perspective, I think it's important for your viewers to understand that Mozilla is a nonprofit organization. So essentially everything that we're doing as part of our development of Firefox is really intended to be in the user's best interest.
Right, so then this is how I guess you can stay out of all the controversy which comes up from something like Operation PRISM. And you've got this other movement as well, a website which is called stopwatching.us. Now tell me about how that is going, because that's been quite a recent development.
Actually, it's really quite phenomenal, the response that we've had to the campaign. So we're just about at the 48-hour mark of the campaign. We now have over 100,000 citizens who've signed a petition. And in particular, what we're really focused on through this campaign is getting users of the internet to understand the implications of massive online surveillance in the systems that they use every day, and getting them engaged in the public dialogue about whether this is the right balance between national security interests and personal privacy protections.
And what is your view when you talk about the dialogue? Are you saying, as the website explicitly says, stop watching us entirely? Or are you saying be transparent about it so that we can make our own informed decisions about privacy?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's important to point out that across the public we have a broad spectrum of values as it relates to personal privacy. So I think we're starting the campaign with the focus on dialogue, with the focus on transparency. Ultimately, we want citizens to engage in the discussions with our policymakers, not just here in the US, but with governments around the world, about how to set the balance appropriately. But I think to the core component of your question, we do think that there is importance of protecting national security, but we just think it's more important that the methods of how we do that work be transparent and public and well understood by the public as a matter of policy.
Alex, I don't know if you can give me a direct answer on this next question, but I'm still going to ask it anyway. What do you think of your competitors and the other tech companies out there who've been implicated in all of this, and if, the leaks are to be believed, are providing this backdoor access for the NSA to get their hands on people's data?
I'm not going to comment directly on any particular company. I certainly feel for them. I think that it's important to understand, right, that these are the laws of the land. They're responding to properly authorized court orders to provide information. So in a sense, they're in a very difficult position. And then they're also told not to say anything about this to anyone, to their users, to the public. So they are to a certain extent in a very difficult position, and so we recognize that, and I think that's why when you look at the underlying business models, right, of all of these companies, Mozilla included, information is increasingly the driver for how our businesses operate. So these types of secret, invasive government surveillance requests go to the very heart of the relationships that we have with our users. So again, if it's not transparent, if people don't understand how it works, what the implications of that are, then it makes it very difficult for people to trust that these service providers are going to be accountable at the end of the day.
Just a final thought then, Alex, on whether you think there might be a change in the air now. Effectively, the US government has been found out here, if you like. They've been rumbled, if I can use that sort of phrase. Do you think that will press them to change their ways now, put pressure on them, I guess?
I think there's no question. I think the pressure has already created change. And we've seen more information being declassified in the last several days than we have in the last 5 or 6 years, right? So, I mean, a lot of organizations have been working for years on these questions of the extent to which online surveillance is taking place. And it's been basically impossible to get information about how these programs work. So to a certain extent, right, we're seeing a lot of change happening just in the last few days. And I expect that through campaigns like the StopWatching.us campaign that we will continue to apply pressure to make sure that we have a full accounting of how these programs are working.
Alex Fowler, Chief Privacy Officer at Mozilla and the movement StopWatching.us. A great pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal.
Now, Iran's presidential election has come and gone, and the new leader will have a lot of work to do, economically speaking. See, this is the story which sometimes gets lost, with all the focus usually on Iran's nuclear program and whether it's for peaceful purposes or not. Iran's economic story starts with oil. According to OPEC, crude production has dropped by 25% over the past 2 years due to international sanctions. That's hit overall growth. The IMF says Iran's real growth rate dropped by 1.9% in 2012 and is projected to do even worse in 2013. And the currency's got problems too. The Iranian rial's lost 70% of its value since the sanctions began. Now, there are some things going up, but they're not good either. Inflation is at a record high of 32%, and the official unemployment rate is up to 12%, but analysts say the real figure is probably double that. Have a look at this now from Soraya Leni in Tehran as she puts some human stories to Iran's economic woes.
Hamid Haydari is a mechanic. His hands are stained with oil and grease from working all day in his shop. With a new wife, he'd hoped all this hard work would soon pay off. Instead, things are getting harder.
The dollar exchange rate has affected all services, especially imports. People can't afford buying things, especially in our field. People pay in installments, prices increase constantly, hour by hour.
This is Varamin, a small city about 2 hours' drive south of Tehran. And it's supposed to be cheaper and easier to live here than the big cities. But the problem is people's incomes can't keep up with the rising costs anymore. Bijan Ghorbani sees this firsthand from his poultry shop.
I have the same number of customers even after prices rose, because people need something to eat. People have no choice but to provide the basic needs.
Although the price of his goods is set by the government, the cost of most other things is not, so they just keep rising. That's why people here want the new president to make fixing the economy his priority. And it's not just the small city of Varamin. Everywhere you go across Iran, people complain about the economy and how they feel powerless to do anything about it.
Now, we talked about oil earlier in that segment, which really is so vital to so many economies, which is why they're getting excited in the United States about a shale revolution, shale being a type of rock from which shale oil and gas can be extracted. Now, perhaps revolution is too strong a term, but it is having an impact on oil prices and global trade, which in turn can change geopolitical relationships. Here's what the US Department of Energy thinks. Technically recoverable shale oil resources, as it says, 345 billion barrels across 42 nations surveyed. That's 10% of the world's crude supplies, enough resources to meet shale oil demand for more than a decade. Drill down a bit further, the US itself has shale reserves of 58 billion barrels. Russia, though, has the largest reserves. And there's shale gas, too, which has kicked the world's total natural gas resources up by 47%. So the numbers are good if we're talking about meeting demand. But think about how it changes the energy map if a country like the US has more of its own supplies. Already we see Nigerian oil exports to the United States have almost halved between 2011 and 2012, while exports from both Angola and Algeria fell more than 30% last year. The big player, Saudi Arabia, is not directly affected because it produces a heavier grade of oil. But it, along with other OPEC countries, would of course prefer to keep oil prices above $100 a barrel. Well, Maria van der Hoeven's with us this week from Paris. She's the Executive Director at the International Energy Agency. And Maria, we're going to look at geopolitics in a moment, but first the oil issue itself. Shale oil, shale production, is it a revolution, as the term goes in the United States? Has it got the potential to change the whole oil playing field?
In the United States, light tight oil, shale oil is definitely a revolution. But of course, it's a young revolution, so it has to be seen how it will go, how it will develop in the years to come. At the same time, some other countries would like to have a revolution like that as well, but there are not really signs of that going to be there. But coming back to the United States, yes, it will make some changes, because what we can see between now and 2028, if light tight oil comes online as we expect it to be, then it will have an influence on the amount of oil that has to be imported and the amount of crude that has to be imported from elsewhere. And we're not only talking about the United States, but it's North America, United States and Canada.
Okay, so short story then, it is a big deal, I guess. I wondered though how it might change relationships. If we're looking specifically at this type of oil, how will it change the supply and demand from other producers and other users?
It will definitely have its influence on trade routes and where crude is going to travel to. What we can see that is that the United States will be less dependent on imports, but still there will be imports also in 2018, because demand is bigger than the domestic supply is. It's still around 3 million barrels a day in difference, so there will still be imports will be needed. But on the other hand, we can see that there's a huge demand of oil in other countries, in Asian countries, in China and India, just to mention two. So what we expect is that trade routes are going to look different than in 2018 than they are looking now.
Okay, very simple question for you here, Maria, and I apologise if it is a bit too simple, actually. But how might this affect the price of oil? You know, given that it is.
I don't think there are. I don't think there are simple questions.
Okay, fair enough. I stand corrected then. Let me ask you then how this would potentially affect the price of oil, given that oil has been up above $100 a barrel consistently for some time. It seems to have found its footing there. Does this have the potential to change that base?
Well, that's not a simple question, as I mentioned before, and there are always many things to take into account when we look at oil prices. But of course, the oil prices of today are one of the features to promote the development of alternatives like light tight oil. We have to be honest about that. We have to be fair about that. And there certainly could be an effect on prices, because more oil on markets, look into market fundamentals, demand and supply, could have its effect on prices. But as you know, we do not forecast prices, so we have to see how things are going to develop. And one of the most important things, of course, is how much demand will there be for oil in the next years and the next years to come, given the situation that not only the Asian countries but also African countries are really growing, and not only in prosperity but also in their demand for oil.
And if we return to where we actually started this interview, and that's talking about the United States, which talks a lot about this idea of energy independence. Now, whether it could gain energy independence from shale oil and gas, I mean, I think that's a debatable sort of topic. But even if it starts going down that sort of route of being more energy dependent, not needing others' oil, again, that can change the political map, can't it?
Well, one thing is true, that is that whatever happens in a big country, that will have its consequences in other countries as well. That is true. But there's another thing. Any country that thinks that it can be an energy island in itself, I don't think that will be true. Because there are always the questions of demand and supply. And this light tight oil, yes, the revolution is there in the United States, that's true. But on the other hand, when you look at the demand for light tight oil in that same United States, that's different, because the refineries need other crude as well. So we have to take into account, it's not only about one product, it's not only about one energy source. We are in a global energy world, and as I mentioned before, no country is an energy island.
Indeed. Maria van der Hoeven from the International Energy Agency in Paris. A real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. More for you online, though, at aljazeera.com/business. The latest business headlines, plus all of our previous episodes for you to catch up on. And then to get in touch, you can tweet either me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or drop us an old-fashioned email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santa Maria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.